task group that was involved in much of the work building up to this. So I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the State University of New York, the Suny Faculty Advisory Council on Teaching and Technology's Adaptive Learning Task Group, the Suny Fact2's Examining Pedagogy and Learning in Online Domains, or EXPLODE Task Group, and the Suny OER Services, Suny Center for Professional Development, and the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, APLU, who all have worked together to do this, which much of the work going through both CPD and the APLU. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first week of Suny's virtual symposium on adaptive learning. I would also like to acknowledge the vendor sponsors who will be joining us over the next 4 weeks and who are here today: Lumen Learning, Realize It, Carnegie Mellon University's Open Learning Initiative, or OLI, Cogbooks, and McGraw-Hill. And thank you for your participation in this event. So we'd like to ask people to, we like to give people the option of showing your faces if you'd like. That's optional. Please mute yourself when you're not going to be talking, and to use the chat feature to share or ask questions. And I'm really pleased to see that we have 270 people registered for this event. And we're going to be, and so we're going to ask you that you use the chat feature and hold off with your questions until the end, until we get through the initial presentations. The symposium sessions will be recorded each week and made available on the registration site. And this symposium series lets us ask some really important questions. How has this disruption that we experienced this spring in higher ed made us perhaps curious about new and better ways or alternative ways of reaching our students? What does it mean to personalize learning? And we'll be talking about that today and over the next 4 weeks. And how can these tools make us more effective in teaching and help our students be more effective in their learning? And we'll also be exploring what's adaptive about adaptive courseware. And the agenda, you should have all received a copy in email, but this is the agenda we'll be following today. And I'd like to introduce our provost, Dr. Todd Laursen, the Senior Vice Chancellor and Provost of the State University of New York. And Provost Laursen will now offer some opening remarks.
Oh, great, and thanks, John. Can you all hear me all right?
We can.
You know, you'd think after several weeks of muting and unmuting and non-stop Zooming, I would have the hang of it, but it still gets glitchy at times. So it's really a pleasure to be with all of you and to see, I think, the focus on adaptive learning, which, as John indicated, has been a subject of interest to Fact2 and other entities throughout the system for a while. It's really good that we've been able to collectively figure out a way to make this happen and exchange ideas and best practices and opportunities for the future. So I want to add my welcome to those John just expressed. I think just by way of a little bit of background, APLU, which was mentioned earlier, hosted an Adaptive Learning Day at Houston Community College. And Lumen and others participated in this, and it sort of caught the attention of our OER services team in particular, that wondered about the prospect for doing something similar here. They reached out to Lumen and APLU to develop a similar event for SUNY faculty, and it came through Fact2 and the Adaptive Learning Task Force. And we had it all scheduled actually in April at Empire, and you can see, or you can predict, many of you will know how that story turned out. Obviously with COVID, that event had to be postponed. So as we've done with a lot of things, we're obviously pivoting. This is an enormously important topic for us. And I think that, if you just look at the experience we've all had together over the last semester and now through the summer and planning for the fall, we're all figuring out in real time how to support wide-scale transitions to online, hybrid, remote learning strategies. And so I think this topic becomes particularly pertinent. The The event that had been planned previously was a one-day event, and we tried to think about a way, I think, that could reformulate that in a way that, you know, most people, myself included, don't necessarily like to sit at a terminal for 8 hours as a go or at a go. And so we tried to sort of think about ways this might be able to be delivered remotely that would be more flexible for people and that would enable their participation. And so I think that this 4-week webinar series that we're introducing today is really going to be an effective showcase for the work that's being done in adaptive learning in Suny. And it's going to give our faculty a chance to interact a little bit with the vendor provided products and find out a little bit more about what's possible. As John mentioned, we really like to thank our partners, Lumen Learning and OLI, McGraw-Hill, Cogbooks, and Realizit for adjusting their plans and joining us and sort of bearing with us with the different schedule changes that have happened. So this sort of remote shift, I referred to it earlier, and I think, you know, we all, you know, have been through this experience and have seen, I think, you know, the challenge that's ahead of all of us as educators is, and I think we all feel the pressure a little bit, right? That when we look at what we've done in the spring, it was really admirable. It was heartening for me to see, as somebody who's relatively new to Suny, you know, how quickly we were able to not only individually on campuses make those personal shifts to delivering online, but sort of activate or engage those networks that were available, like the ones that are involved in this symposium, particularly to support those faculty who needed the support, that maybe were doing things that they had not done before. And, you know, just to see and be a part of the speed and the collaborative nature, you know, with which folks did that work was really heartening to see. And there are a lot of interesting lessons, I think, learned in that, and that are likely to come up in the talks in this symposium. We've obviously, that pivot involved both synchronous and asynchronous remote education. I think that there was a lot of learning done about which modes and which ways of delivery tended to be more effective in engaging students and staying connected to them. We know that not all of those transitions happened perfectly, right? So faculty, I think, to their credit, and I heard several talks about this during the spring semester, you know, we're really able to sense that situation pretty quickly and make needed adjustments. And so I think that adaptability, although maybe not as sort of computer intelligence guided as what we're going to be talking about in these 8 hours or so, is really important. I think it's a recognition that that individualization is important, that that adaptability to what a student needs when they need it is important. And this gives us an opportunity maybe to, you know, think about that a little bit more intentionally for the future. So I just would like to share a little bit about how adaptive learning tools and platforms are being used in higher education for those of you maybe who haven't thought about this as much. The technology is designed to provide individualized learning paths, as I mentioned earlier, for our students, and sort of uses a data-driven approach to adjust the pace of learning that'll enable the delivery of individualized learning at scale. And that's obviously very pertinent to the challenge we're collectively facing now. Adaptive learning tools are being used in credit-bearing as well as in non-credit-bearing courses, and it includes sort of ancillary activities that are quite important to our students' success. For example, classes focused on college readiness, and there are several examples that are listed here and will be talked about, I think, in the next few sessions. An interesting point to me, which I'm interested in hearing more about, it turns out that these adaptive learning tools can provide both synchronous interaction in what you might ordinarily consider to be an asynchronous environment. So that synchronous nature of the interaction is something that's very important to our students, and it turns out that frameworks are being developed that are amenable to that, and I think that's quite important. The other thing we should say probably about adaptive learning approaches is that they're ideal for large seat classes, because they allow learners to follow the path most appropriate for them. And that can really be hard in a large class. And, I think the intersections one can see with, for example, our online initiative and some of the other things that are ongoing in Suny are pertinent here to figure out how successful strategies can actually be brought to scale. So that's a very important feature for us. So I'll just complete here by saying that this event really builds nicely off the work that the Fact2 group that John mentioned earlier has been doing on adaptive learning. The task force has made several recommendations, and I'm not going to go through them all here, but I think one of the more pertinent ones is that they recommended that there be support for promoting awareness and adoption of adaptive and personalized learning systems and platforms available in this space. And so that's very well aligned, I think, with the goals of the symposium that we're starting now. Suny OER Services is taking the lead on that, and that's, as I said, that's what this event is about. And so it's really looking to sort of carry forward that momentum that's been built in different Suny communities. And I think to provide a service and maybe a level of innovation that's going to be helpful for all of us as we think about how to further improve our offerings in the COVID environment. So I think that brings us then finally to the goals for the virtual symposium, and I think that's probably territory best covered by John rather than me. So I'm going to hand it back, and I look forward to being with you for the next hour or so and learning a bit myself. Thank you very much for making time to be with us.
Thank you, Dr. Laursen. So the goals of the symposium is to provide some good examples of Suny faculty who have been teaching with adaptive learning, in some cases for a few years now, to talk about the capabilities of some of the major adaptive learning tools and platforms, where we'll have presentations by all that, and also to help build connections so that faculty who are thinking about working with adaptive learning can interact with each other and perhaps lighten the load of transitioning to new modes of teaching by sharing some of those tasks and sharing ideas. And we also want this to provide faculty, to assist faculty in the transition to online learning or remote instruction or whatever is going to happen this fall, because we have a lot of uncertainty about it, and these tools can make things a whole lot easier over the next couple of semesters. So I'd like to welcome our two keynote speakers, Dr. David Wiley and Norman Bier. David Wiley is a co-founder and chief academic officer of Lumen Learning, an organization dedicated to increasing student success, reinvigorating pedagogy, and improving the affordability of education through the adoption of OER. Previously, David was associate professor in the Department of Instructional Psychology and Technology at Brigham Young University. He has received numerous recognitions, including an NSF Career Grant, appointments as Education Fellow at Creative Commons, much of which grew out of his earlier work on this. He's a non-resident fellow at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School and Ashoka Fellow. David was a postdoctoral fellow at Utah State University after earning a PhD in instructional psychology and technology from Brigham Young University. Norman Bier is a director of the Open Learning Initiative, OLI, at Carnegie Mellon University. His work sits at the intersection of Carnegie Mellon University's internal educational practice, ongoing learning science research, and external collaboration. Norman has spent his career at the intersection of learning and technology, working to expand access to and improve the quality of education. His experience spans the higher educational sector, including 2-year and 4-year, public and private, domestic and international, and commercial institutions. He has taught computer science classes as an adjunct faculty member at the Community College of Allegheny County, philosophy courses at Carnegie Mellon University, and served as a founding committee member of the Cook Honors College at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. As a leader in open education and educational technology, in 2015, he was selected by the Center for Digital Education as one of their top 30 technologists, transformers, and trailblazers. Welcome, David and Norman.
Thank you. Well, that's a lot of introduction.
Well, you guys have both done a phenomenal amount. So maybe we could start by having each of you talk just a little bit about the adaptive or personalized learning approaches that are used in David's Waymaker platform or in OLI's adaptive learning system.
Norman, would you like to go first?
Make sure you are unmuted.
Yeah, Norman, we're not hearing you. Well, perhaps while we wait for Norman to sort that out, maybe I'll take a swing at your question, John.
Okay.
So the particular approach to personalization in Waymaker. Oh, sorry, go again, Norman. The approach to personalization in Waymaker is really one of not doing things for students so much as I think the traditional approach to personalization is kind of collecting data about a student, their kind of engagement behaviors, their performance on assessments and other kinds of activities in the system, building up a model of what the system believes the student to know or to understand, and then making choices on behalf of the student to present them with kind of the optimum or the best thing that they could watch next or read next or do next. Waymaker follows that path up to a certain point in that we do collect the same kinds of data, we build the same kind of model of what we think the state of the student's understanding is. But then at that point, rather than making choices on behalf of the student, we show those data to the student with some suggestions about what they might do next and an invitation to kind of reflect on their own learning data, read our recommendations, or read a brief rationale behind why that particular recommendation. And really there's an effort to get them to be a little more metacognitive and to think about their own learning, to think about their own data, how they're performing. And instead of the system getting smarter and smarter about the student and how they should be learning, really trying to help the student get smarter and smarter about thinking about their own data, thinking about how to use their study time, what to do, where to invest that. So just to summarize, there is some data collection and model building, but then rather than making decisions on the student's behalf, it's really an attempt to try to get students involved in that process.
And my understanding is that the data collection is used to improve the product in future iterations as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, let's definitely spend some time talking about continuous
We'll
improvement.
get back to it.
I know Norman loves that topic too.
Okay, Norman, we heard some sound from there. Is everything working now?
You tell me. Am I
Yes.
actually making noise at this point? So,
Yes.
sorry, where I started to dive in was to thank all of you for coming out on such a beautiful day. I think, and now the other side of this is sort of recognizing what so many of our learners are going through as they mess with technologies that aren't working and microphones that aren't coming together. I think past few weeks and months have been exhausting, and it's sort of amazing to me to see nearly 300 of you here interested in learning more about adaptive broadly. So the Open Learning Initiative has been engaging in the development of online courseware for about 20 years, and we take a couple of different approaches to adaptivity. At some very key level, we're focused on adapting to learner interactions, and most of the time this means providing targeted feedback and targeted hints based on the kinds of answers that learners are providing. But we're also taking the information that we collect from those learner answers and feeding it through some modeling systems that can provide better guidance to the student on how they're achieving certain skills and learning objectives. And from there, hopefully, helping them in making better decisions about how they engage with the materials. That same information we provide back to faculty members to try to give them key insights into where their learners are succeeding, where their learners are struggling, and maybe more importantly, what are the kinds of misconceptions that learners are exhibiting? We see a really key point of adaptivity happening at that place where faculty are engaging with students, where they're able to adapt their instruction. And we think that the more insights we're able to provide, the more they're able to take advantage of, it's frankly a pretty precious amount of time that they have to engage with their learners. So this is a different piece of adaptivity. OLI also supports the ability to plug in other kinds of activities. And so we'll plug in third-party labs, third-party tutors, and frequently those systems will then support their own kind of adaptivity loops. They're frequently self-contained. So we may have an intelligent tutoring system that's walking students through the process of analyzing data, and that can provide more targeted points of adaptation. And so when we think about how we support adaptive learning, we're trying to support learners. We're clearly supporting faculty in this. And we try to provide a place where different kinds of technologies and platforms can also support adaptive approaches.
So two things you mentioned in your presentations are the customization for individual learners' needs, and also the fact that both systems provide the instructor with some data. What are some of the other reasons why we might, or faculty should consider the adoption of an adaptive or personalized learning system?
So, gosh, there's a whole bunch of reasons. I mean, I think that at some very key level, what we have found from 20 years of research is that these kinds of adaptive learning systems have the capability to improve learning outcomes and to level the playing field. And so at a very basic level, as we're thinking about how we engage and support with our learners, taking advantage of these kinds of systems, give us some additional insights into the learning that's happening outside of our classroom, and help us to better understand the kinds of experiences that students may be having when they're face-to-face with us. And that's key, and I don't want to suggest that we shouldn't be focused on the learner. But in addition to those things, we also see these kinds of platforms as an opportunity for educators to engage a little more authentically in taking advantage of evidence, taking advantage of and participating in ongoing learning research. And we think that one of the things that OLI brings to the table is this capability, both as a platform and as an organization, to invite a broader population of faculty to start to participate in not just using these kinds of courseware, but also in going in, modifying, tweaking, and in beginning to run and engage in their own kind of testing to both understand what works in their class, but also to give us a broader understanding of how human learning works.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is that there's, those of us who've been teaching for a long time they're used to sending students away to have them read, hoping that they'll come back to class, being prepared. That not always being the case, and so then we typically lecture about the same thing that we asked them to read about before they came to class, and that never ends up feeling like the best use of anybody's time. I think these personalized systems, to Norman's point, they do support better learning, they support more active learning. The research shows, I'm sure Norman will talk about the doer effect before we're done, but I won't steal his thunder on that one. But having students be better prepared when they show up to class and being able to see their level of preparation before they come into the classroom by looking at the way they've used the system, looking at their performance in a dashboard, makes it so that you can do more interesting, more engaging, more effective things in the classroom. So for me as a teacher, the reason I would want to use a system like this is because I could assign it, have students do those things before they show up, either for the synchronous online portion or for the face-to-face portion, and know where they were, what they'd been confused about, what I didn't need to talk about because most of them had gotten it, and really let me make really targeted, effective use of my face-to-face time with them, which is so precious and so limited, that it lets me be a better teacher. So that would be another reason to think about using one of these systems.
And I think that that's even more important right now. As I'm prepping to teach next week for our summer 2 session, and I'll be using the OLI platform to teach computer science. And what I've been thinking really hard about is, as we engage in this with weird pivoted modality, how do I provide active asynchronous learning opportunities? And there's an awful lot of reading on the desperate need our learners have for these kinds of asynchronous opportunities and the ways that traditional synchronous approaches aren't translating well in this pivot. So I think the capabilities that these types of platforms have for providing that active asynchronous learning, much better than a video, much better than straight reading, and that can then inform what we're able to do when we do come together for that synchronous time is really, really important. So I think those are plenty of reasons to adopt these kinds of systems, although maybe equally interesting is the list of reasons we shouldn't be adopting these systems, but that may be a different keynote.
So another point I think that ties into what you were just saying is that when people use traditional texts, students often delay buying them, and it takes a while before they actually start. And the people who are most likely to delay the acquisition of buying a textbook are the students who generally most need that sort of support of getting a head start on it. So, by using an online platform such as this, in addition to all the other tools that it does, is it gives everyone direct access, and it gives students some really important evidence-based practices in any of the adaptive or personalized learning systems in terms of immediate giving students feedback right as they're working. It helps them improve their metacognition through that rapid feedback, and it's also giving them lots of examples of retrieval practice and letting them work on their own to attain mastery. In a webinar we had last year, Flower Darby suggested that adaptive learning in many ways is most helpful for the students in the back of the lecture room, the back of the hall, the people who might generally stay a little bit out of the discussions in your class if you're meeting face-to-face. And it basically allows everyone to get up to speed, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the research, but there is a fair amount of research that it does tend to narrow some of the achievement gaps, and we'll get to that. But providing that first day access, and since many of the platforms use OER resources, it also lowers the cost of education, which also is helpful, especially now. So perhaps we could move to a discussion of what does research tell us about the effectiveness of adaptive learning or personalized learning?
Norman, I think I already bumped and set to you on the doer effect, if you want to talk about that.
Sure. So I think that, one of the roles that OLI plays inside of CMU is to really provide a platform for understanding what works in learning. How can we leverage the affordances of technology? And what we see over and over again is that appropriately designed learning environments really are able to add efficiencies in the learning process. They're able to improve learning outcomes, and they're able to close gaps in a lot of populations that traditionally will see challenges, especially in the online space. But there are some key phrases there, right? Like, I think it's very difficult to make a blanket assertion that all types of personalized courseware, all types of digital courseware are equally effective, and that's not just a differentiator between products. We see this inside of OLI, where we may see two different courses with similar, broad-based design approaches, but down in the weeds, the kind of implementations that they develop can show very different results. So what do we know that does work? What does the research tell us is sort of most important? David made reference to the doer effect, and this is a reference to a paper that I was able to work on with Ken Kadinger, the learning scientist here at CMU, where we were fortunate to be able to investigate the impact of different types of learning activities on student learning. So we were partnering with a MOOC being delivered through Coursera, where we see students engaging with the MOOC videos, taking quizzes on the MOOC, but then leveraging OLI as a combination of reading and active learning platform. And this gives us a chance to ask, what kind of impact do we see coming from these videos? What's the impact of just reading? And what's the impact of engaging in these richer learn by doing activities? What we found is that watching a video does help you learn. There's definitely impact there. But that the students that were reading were seeing twice the impact than the students that were simply engaged in the video. And maybe more important for our purposes, the students that were engaged in these learn by doing activities, we were seeing that those activities had 6 times the impact on learning outcomes. As we've tried to take, so this was embedded in a psychology course. We have applied the same methodology across some different courses, range from French and computer science to another round of the psychology course to statistics. So really trying to get a broader set of domains. And a lot of this work was done in partnership with some public institutions in Maryland. So it's been a pretty broad array of learners, not just the folks that were showing up at the MOOC. And while the specific impact of learn by doing versus reading versus video, would vary a bit from course to course, we consistently saw that major impact of learn by doing. So I think we can talk a lot about different design methodologies, different approaches and philosophies in developing online courseware. But what we know down in the weeds works is developing active learning opportunities that are going to give students feedback, that can give them targeted hints, and that can really address misconceptions. We see huge impacts from that across every learner population that we've investigated.
I mean, one of the things that's great about it is that here's a case where the research actually aligns with our intuition. Right? A lot of our practices in education are grounded in our intuition, and our intuition doesn't always lead us in the most productive direction. But I think it's pretty intuitive to understand that you can't become a great pianist by reading books about playing the piano. At some point, you have to go do the thing of playing the piano. You can't, become a great mathematician about reading history by reading histories of mathematicians. John, you said the words retrieval practice a minute ago, which I was glad to hear you say. We do have this mental model that learning is about getting stuff into me. It's about reading things in or watching videos in. But what you find, I think another way of talking about the Stewart effect is that if you flip over and say learning isn't about practicing putting things in, learning is about practicing getting them back out again, right? And how many opportunities are there to play the piano, or to actually write the code in the programming language, or to actually speak French with someone, not just reading about it, but doing it. And so every time there's an opportunity to have us practice pulling things out, rather than engaging in practices like reading or watching that are about putting things in, the more of that there is in a course, the better it's gonna be. And I think this example of a 6 times greater effect, over 12,000 students and 4 different courses in the study that Norman's talking about, it's a very stable effect, it's well understood, and it's personalized or adaptive kind of systems are a great place to find that kind of interactivity.
And there's lots of opportunity for faculty that are interested in this kind of research to jump in and run these types of analyses on their own. I think one of the drums that I've been beating over the past year is really trying to encourage more citizen science, in this case, citizen learning science. And so we've taken these analytic tools and made them available at CMU under a larger project called LearnSphere. And so if there are faculty who are interested in exploring what are the roles of different kinds of learning activities and how do they seem to impact their student learning, we'd love to collaborate and work with you on helping you in that work.
So, and another factor is I think the benefits of retrieval practice have been known for a long time, and the benefits of giving students feedback have been known for a long time. But one of the problems is that often required a lot more work for the faculty. With adaptive or personalized learning systems, basically it's computer mediated in terms of the lower levels of understanding, which lets students do this on their own and get the feedback without that sort of intervention. And as you both implied a bit, it allows faculty to focus on higher level cognition in the classroom and basically to build on a solid foundation where students can develop at their own pace. Some students may be able to zip through things very quickly if they come in with a rich background. Others are going to be still using their time more efficiently by focusing on those things outside of class that they need the most practice on. And the ability to give students that sort of practice results in really dramatic learning gains in pretty much every study I've ever seen, and there's hundreds of them, probably thousands of them out there.
Hey John, before you leave that point, I don't want to give the impression that that these systems are kind of set it and forget it. Like you just put students in front of it, and then you as the faculty member don't have to engage with them anymore. You don't have to reach out to them. You don't have to do anything. We've seen over and over again, including specifically in some recent analysis that we did at Suny, at Bier, that the degree to which the faculty member is in the courseware, taking advantage of the tools, looking at the dashboard, actually customizing what they do in their classroom based on that, sending email messages out to students based on what they see in the dashboard. This kind of courseware is a powerful tool for students, but it's also a powerful tool for faculty. And if faculty come into this relationship thinking that they can just kind of throw this over the wall to students and they don't have to think about it anymore, you won't see the kind of dramatic effect that you can potentially see when the students are engaged in using the functionality the way it's designed, and the faculty member is in there really taking advantage of that as well. So I just want to make sure we don't give the wrong impression.
Yeah, not only does it let students focus their time more efficiently, it lets faculty do it on the areas where there's the most need for student support. So you don't waste time in class, whatever mode your class is, on things that students have mastered. You can focus on the things that they need the most assistance with. So it allows for much more efficient instruction, but without obviating the need for personal interaction. So yeah, we can't neglect any of that. And I see there's, Norman has shared something in terms of a research study on learning is not a spectator sport. Doing is better than watching for learning from a MOOC. So one of the areas that I know there's been some research on is the achievement gap. Do you have any research that has been done on your platforms about how this perhaps may affect the achievement gap, particularly in the STEM disciplines where we often see larger gaps?
Maybe I'll go first on this one. In my 5-minute overview of Waymaker coming up later today, stay tuned. There will be one slide that goes by where I'll talk about a study looking exactly at that with I'll just grab the number real quickly here. This is a study of 5,600 students at 8 different institutions. And what we're looking specifically at, and you'll see in the presentation here, is the performance gap between students who are Pell eligible and their peers who aren't. And this is after controlling for a large number of other factors, controlling for age, for gender, for whether this was their first attempt at the course or not, whether they're full-time or part-time, whether they're taking the course face-to-face or online or in a blended mode, and including their prior GPA also as a covariate in this model, still showing that using, in this particular case, using Waymaker is associated with an improvement in performance that's just slightly greater than the decrease in performance is associated with being Pell eligible. So in other words, if you had the opportunity to use Waymaker, it closed that gap. And to my mind, the explanation of that phenomenon is that if you have come from a really terrific school, you've had lots of great teachers, you got maybe access to tutors or things like that when you were growing up, you probably learned a lot about how to study. You come to college with a metacognitive toolkit that has a hammer and a screwdriver and a saw and kind of all the tools in it. I think the reason that you see this gap close, instead of high-performing students doing even better and that gap just sort of sliding upward, is that these kind of metacognitive supports that that Waymaker in this case is providing are giving the Pell-eligible students access to that same set of tools to put them on a level playing field. The students who already have those tools don't benefit by getting additional support for that. So instead of seeing that gap slide, you see it close. And that's one of the most exciting results that we've seen in the work that we've been doing on Waymaker.
I think that we've seen some similar results in different studies across the OLI courses. Frequently, the kinds of investigations that we're doing will narrow in on one specific course. And so investigating our chemistry course, what we found is that student engagement with the courseware in the virtual laboratory ends up outweighing other factors in predicting student success, including SAT score, gender, socio and economic status, right? So what we're finding is that some of these interventions, even by themselves, are able to do a better job of supporting success and closing that gap. Two of the other interesting studies that we've seen, engaging with some colleagues at UC Davis around an OLI biology course a few years back, a study funded by the Gates Foundation. And OLI had also engaged with a large-scale investigation into the use of courseware in gatekeeper courses in community colleges. We talk about that as the CCOLI project. In both of those projects, what we see is that the use of this courseware is able to close gaps that are often seen in traditionally vulnerable populations. And so looking at socioeconomic status, first-generation college status, gender, and race. But what we find is that equally important is the way that faculty members make use of the courseware, that not all uses of this courseware are created equally. And I think that that's as interesting and maybe as important for us, that we really need to not look at any of these technologies as a silver bullet that's going to just come in and solve all of our problems for us, nor are these magic artificial intelligence kinds of technologies that are going to come in and replace educators in the classroom, right? That, this is simply another set of tools inside of an educator's toolkit, but the way that they make use of these has tremendous impact.
Yeah, and maybe just to tack onto that, I don't know how many of you are fans of Jim Wirch and his work on mediational means. He uses this metaphor of, pole vaulting as a sport originally used a rigid wooden pole. And at some point it switched over to using a flexible fiberglass pole. And there was a lot of controversy about whether the pole was just throwing you over the bar because it would bend and release energy and things like that. But I think it really is a great metaphor for thinking about transitioning from a textbook to a piece of adaptive courseware. Yet having a fiberglass pole as opposed to a wooden pole, if you don't know how to use it, if you don't practice with it, if you don't engage with it properly, it's just another pole. And so the idea that there's so much more potential and capability here is absolutely true. But again, you can't overemphasize the importance of the faculty member in these kinds of tools being used effectively and being used well, and really being something that can help the faculty member get kind of higher, better, faster than they could with the kinds of tools they had access to in the past.
So we've talked a little bit about how how students can improve their efficiency and time by using results from the feedback they're getting, how faculty can use that to improve the efficiency of their instruction. Could you tell us a little bit about how your companies or how your platforms use the data you're collecting in terms of what students are learning effectively and where there are some choke points to change and evolve the products over time?
Sure. I think that this notion of data-driven iterative improvement has been a really key area for OLI. It's been a place we've been making some pretty deep investments over the past few years. Some of those areas are exactly what you would expect, that we're able to leverage data to see what are the resources students are using. Of those resources that they are making use of, which ones seem to have the greatest impact, where are the places where, despite use, students aren't seeing good results, and thus, where is it that the course performance doesn't seem to align well with the model of learning that we've developed. And from that gives us the chance to jump in and refine and fine-tune content. It gives us the chance to expand content by creating new questions, new kinds of problems. We've also been using this to identify places where, we think of as sort of basic native OLI activities aren't doing enough to support students in developing more robust skill sets. And so these are places where we then decide that we should be making an investment in some of the higher end tutors or higher end labs. Those tend to be, these kinds of changes tend to be very content focused. I think that at the same time, we're going to be continuing to use data to improve and fine tune the larger learning models that we use, both to validate our work, but also to drive the learning analytics platforms that we provide to students and faculty. So these make these more accurate and more reflective of the learners that we're engaging in. Lately, we've also been trying to use the data that we collect to help more faculty use that data effectively. A little bit meta there, but getting a better sense of how our faculty take advantage of our analytics platforms, whether that's in delivering a learning experience or in going in and refining and creating their own learning experiences. That really touches on an awful lot of core human-computer interaction principles that we're really able to make this interface more useful and thoughtful for educators. And in the grandest scheme of things, all of the data that we're collecting, we are feeding back into the learning sciences, and we're using this to drive more science and a better understanding of human learning. And so at the broadest end, we're not just looking to improve the courseware, we're looking to improve learning across the board.
Yeah, and I would be remiss if I didn't say that, Norman was doing this work before we even founded Lumen. And so, there's a lot of history and a lot of work that's been done there that has been inspirational to us and the work that we do and the way we approach it. I think the only thing I would add to what Norman has said in terms of Lumen's approach specifically is that we have a particular way that we analyze the engagement and the performance, the assessment performance data that comes together in a report that tells us basically here are the 10 individual learning outcomes in the course in which the students were most highly engaged in the related content, practice opportunities, things like that, but they also performed the worst. And so where does it look like students are really making effort? They're studying, restudying, practicing, doing everything we ask and still performing poorly on the summative assessments. And so something that we've been doing for just a little over a year now is creating those reports and then publishing them. So you can go to our website and you can see these continuous improvement reports, the analysis available for all the Waymaker courses. And then we use those data internally to engage in a range of improvement activities like Norman was talking about. But then we also go out to campuses and do, well, there was a time when we went out to campuses. We haven't in a couple of months to do face-to-face workshops, but in the fall we're at Empire State and getting together with faculty and looking at these data and working together to facilitate a faculty-led process of this kind of improvement should be made to the assessments. This kind of improvement should be made to the content. And then we've also done some virtual hackathons, we call them, where we get people together in a webinar setting like this, talk through those data, do a little training about how to create interactive activities, and then break out and do some of that asynchronously and bring it all back together on the back end. But I think for both of us, there's very much a focus on collecting these data, trying to interpret them in ways that you've all taught a class, and then when you come back to teach it again, you think, well, I've got a couple of hours I can, invest in making this class a little better before I teach it again, but where do I spend them? And you try to remember back to where people had struggled last time you taught. It's really great to be able to go in, look at the data, see what students did, where they're confused, and then leverage that data into these kind of collaborative improvement opportunities, working either face-to-face with faculty or online with faculty.
Now we're moving into a fall semester after a somewhat challenging spring where we all suddenly stop face-to-face instruction, and we don't know exactly what the fall will bring. It's likely that we won't see as many large classes, at least not meeting regularly. They're likely, if they meet, they'll either be meeting online or they'll be meeting in small groups in a hybrid format. In what ways can adaptive and personalized systems perhaps help or not help in preparing for another pandemic teaching semester?
I think there are a bunch of ways in which it can't help at all, right? Because the problems aren't academic problems. The problems are the trauma, all the things that are going on in students' lives with their livelihoods outside of work, with family members who are sick, with jobs that they've lost. There's all the problems that are the most important problems the courseware can't do anything about, right? And we should all admit that and be honest about that. In as much as the courseware can make it so that you can learn the same amount that you would have learned previously, but learn it faster, that these kind of engaging in these interactive practice opportunities gives you better leverage in terms of how much you can learn per unit time that you spend. There are ways I think that the courseware can help you kind of learn what you need to learn, get that done, and get on with doing other things that are important in your life with everything that's going on outside. And I think there are also ways that a faculty member who, I don't want to say this the wrong way, but a faculty member who is really invested in kind of getting to know their students and caring about them and trying to be a stabilizing or a helpful or some kind of useful influence to their students while all these things are going on in the world. I think you'll be able to see some of that reflected in the data in these systems that you might not be able to see otherwise. Students who are inactive for long periods of time, students who are doing very well, who are suddenly doing very poorly. I think it does, if you feel like part of the call of being a teacher is really kind of caring about and trying to support kind of extra academically, what's happening in your students' lives. I think there's a lot of opportunity to do that with the kind of functionality that these systems provide.
Your first point there, David, was a perfect one. I think prior to walking into this summit was attending the weekly CMU check-in on what's the state of the university? What are we doing in the fall? And, you know, in the face of hearing about what's going on with our international students right now and what's going on with these larger questions of social justice, and or do we have filters that are going to clean the air, and how far are students going to be standing apart? It's really struck at the time by the fact that there's nothing OLI is going to do in the face of those kinds of challenges. But what adaptive courseware does provide, again, is I think that chance to give students an active asynchronous learning opportunity. And you know, what we're seeing over and over again, even prior to heading into COVID spring, was this notion that these types of asynchronous experiences are very important from an equity perspective. That's trying to purely replace all of our experiences face-to-face with you know, an online experience, this kind of Zoom experience, not only wasn't as effective for most learners, but really further deepens that gap between the haves and the have-nots. And so rather than addressing some of those achievement gaps that we're trying to solve, we end up seeing them worsen. And these types of courseware experiences give those students the chance to engage with the materials in a more thoughtful and more active way. It can inform what we're doing, and so hopefully move a lot of these types of Zoom interactions from the type of one-directional interaction that we're having now, right? You know, and that's, you know, it's sort of being blunt, like John and David and I are having a little bit of a chat, but for most of you, this could be recorded, right? And instead informing what an educator is able to do when we're standing in this format, in place of so many of the usual cues that we get in the classroom and that we're able to respond to when we're seeing our students face to face. But beyond those pieces, I think that, you know, what this provides us is flexibility. I think that none of us know what the fall is going to bring. We're all spending a lot of time planning for, you know, most likely experience, but also trying to figure out what are our contingencies. Are we coming back after Thanksgiving? Are we going to need to end early? How many students can I fit into a classroom? And I think that the design that has gone into these kinds of experiences really make them robust enough to stand up to these different kinds of use cases, and leaves you with a lot of options in terms of, you know, these needs to rapidly. What it can't do for us, though, is it's not a solution. While it's a solution that can be rapidly brought to bear when it's already been developed, I think what we shouldn't be expecting of faculty is that they can dive in and quickly develop really robust adaptive digital courseware, right? Like, got July, the semester's starting in a month, like get in there, build yourself some courseware. I think, you know, really recognizing what kind of investment in educators needs to happen for this stuff to develop is going to be important as well.
And before we move to the Q&A, one question that I think is generally applicable is, what should faculty be looking at or considering if they're planning to, or if they want to investigate some type of courseware, adaptive or personalized?
So I guess I would a couple of things I would encourage them not to do, again, rather than just, you know, what to look for, some things to avoid. You know, none of us have a magical AI that is going to teach for you. And recognizing that, I think that as we move from the notion of a static textbook to something that we're calling courseware, the courseware starts to come much closer to how I think of myself as an educator, how I engage in and teach my class. And I think that there's a quick tendency to eyeball a piece of material. So that's not how I teach. This can't support me, nor can it support my students. And so I think I would really encourage educators, as they're looking at this, to take a breath and think about this more in the vein of, you know, as they've approached textbook adoptions, think not about how does this replace my practice or how does this not align with it, but what are the places where these kinds of materials could plug in.
David?
Yeah, and then there are Oh gosh, just the practical considerations around faculty professional development. Like, what kind of support is there going to be for you to use these tools? It is a lot like, you know, switching from just a stiff wooden rod to jump across a creek to transitioning to a fiberglass pole to try to, you know, jump up into the air. There is a bit of a learning curve. If you've never taught in a data-driven way before as a faculty member, there's a bit of a mind shift kind of set that's, you know, instead of saying, well, it's Tuesday, today's the day that I talk about this topic, you know, to start the day by going in and looking at the student data and seeing which parts of that they've already got nailed, and it's going to be a waste of everyone's time for you to talk about them further, and an opportunity lost to spend more time talking about the things everyone's struggling with. Like, just developing these habits of kind of being data informed in your teaching. It's hard to do. It's so easy to fall back into, you know, the kind of the way that we've always taught in the past. And I guess what kind of support is going to be available to you is another kind of question to ask yourself as you think about moving into these systems, because unsupported, what's likely to happen is you'll adopt this courseware and then you'll assign it as if it were a textbook, and you'll continue to teach as if you had assigned a traditional textbook to students, and you won't get the kind of lift that you're looking for out of that kind of engagement.
Okay, now we're open to questions. There was a question from Keith Landa asking about what sort of platform would be good, and I think Norman has just answered that, looking at ASU's Education Through Experience Center. So, and also OLI is looking at some use of authoring and improvement tools. Any other suggestions on if there is no adaptive or personalized learning system, what might be a good way of faculty developing their own?
Well, I think the thing I would say is, first, you begin by understanding what you're signing up for, because it's not writing a textbook. I expect several of us will talk about this when we do our kind of 5-minute blitzes here in a few minutes. But what underlies an adaptive or a personalized system is, you know, a network of hundreds of learning outcomes, a collection of a couple of thousand assessment items, and each individual item has been aligned to a learning outcome, aligning all of the other kinds of activities, the practice activities, the video, the content, all with learning outcomes. It's not sitting down and, I mean, just the kind of intimidating task of staring at a word processor and thinking I've got to write a 500-page book. It's way beyond that in terms of the kind of design that goes into it. And when those pieces don't align correctly, when the assessment items aren't aligned to outcomes or the content's not aligned to outcomes, then when you go to do the personalization doesn't work. It makes recommendations that make no sense, or it just doesn't function at all. If you're familiar with this kind of data analysis problem of garbage in, garbage out, that alignment, the outcomes all have to exist, the alignment has to be done. So it's really more, it's more than just saying, tell me the name of a platform in which I could build, you know, an adaptive course, because there's just so much hiding in the weeds in there. It's not that it's not doable. Of course it's doable, because all of us do it. I just think it's important to walk into that understanding what you're really signing up for.
And Karen noted in chat that CogBooks and Realize It do have platforms for creating it, but she echoes David's point that it's a lot of work to do. There's a question from Stephanie Patterson. Are our institutions going to pay for these platforms, or are we expected to? I think that's a really easy answer from either of you, if for people in Suny at least.
Yeah, for either of us, the answer is students don't pay for it.
Suny has a license which is has an agreement with both LI and through Lumen Learning actually for adopting those platforms. So you can adopt them under the current contract for at least the next couple years, like 2.5 years, I believe, at no cost to Suny faculty or students. And Michael Daly said that's part of Suny's OER services offerings. And you can find that on the OER services website, I believe, a link to all of the currently available packages, a list which keeps growing over time. Other questions? So the question is, can these platforms work with existing platforms, Moodle, open source, with assessment across campus, or would be a total switch to new platform?
So I think the answer to this question is going to be a little different for everyone, and maybe everybody will address that a little later in the day. Some of these systems, the content kind of comes right inside the learning management system, and the whole adaptive experience would happen inside of your Moodle, and students wouldn't know that there was a second tool even involved. Other times, you're going to have a link in your Moodle that says, click here to open whatever adaptive platform, and that opens a new window and takes you into a new experience there. So it really varies depending on the particular platform you're talking about.
Most of them do have some type of, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I think I'm headed to the same place, that the depth of integration varies from platform to platform. But I think looking at the list of folks that are participating today, I think all of the platforms have some point of connection with your existing LMS. So there's not a notion that you need to completely abandon your LMS, even if that is simply a link that passes on sign-in information and supports a single sign-on experience.
Yeah, most of them seem to use LTI integration, which should work with Blackboard, Moodle, and Canvas. And you can ask the specific vendors of that as well. Now there's a question from Janet Nepke. If there are no adaptive courses available in certain subject matters, how can faculty develop more adaptive opportunities in their current courses? Similar to Keith's question, I think.
Yeah, maybe I'll go first on this one again. What I would encourage you to do is go take a look at the data that you do have. Go back to gradebooks from past semesters. Sort those out. Try to do some averaging, some sorting with your gradebook data to find out the places where your students really are struggling the most. And I have to say that having done this as a live exercise with groups of faculty in the past, I think you'll be shocked that the assignments and the topics that you remember students struggling with the most will be different from what's borne out in your own gradebook data. And it's an interesting exercise to do because it really helps you appreciate the value of your data compared to your memory of how you think things work. So I would say start in your gradebook data and find the 2 or 3 places where there's a real opportunity to make a lot of improvement, because it is going to take some investment. Even if you can't go off and make an entire adaptive course in a platform, you can use a tool, something like H5P. I'll drop a link in the chat in just a minute if somebody doesn't beat me to it, which is an open source tool for building interactive activities. And these interactive activities can provide immediate feedback, depending on how you design them. That feedback can be targeted to common student misunderstandings. You can get a lot of, you can bring a lot of this benefit down to the single outcome or topic level by doing that kind of work. And please don't do that kind of work without consulting your data first, because your memory about where it would best serve your students is probably wrong.
And there are comments from representatives from Realize It and Cog Books that they do specialize in working with faculty to do that. So, you may want to visit one of their meetings if you want to find out more about that. And we also have a question, a Suny site license. Right now, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, the only site agreement we have is with Lumen Learning and OLI through the Lumen Learning contract. However, if you want to encourage some of the other vendors to work with that, that's a possibility. But many of the other vendors provide relatively low-cost platforms for at least for those courses that are built on OER content. So typically, it's much less expensive than a regular textbook, and you get so much more for it. Now, there's a question from Michelle Benora. Do the skills that students develop using the adaptive systems transfer to other classes that do not make use of such systems? So
that's a great question. And I think if they don't, then there's a real problem with the course, is the short answer. I think that the longer answer is that with really creating an effective learning design that is going to focus on authentic skills development that can be observed and assessed in ways that aren't tied directly to the platform. When we've done investigations into this, I think probably the study that we may be best known for is our accelerated learning study in statistics, where we were looking at students leveraging the OLI statistics course in comparison to students that were taking a traditional statistics class at CMU. And we were very explicitly looking at transfer and retention semester after the fact, using assessment instruments that weren't embedded in the OLI platform. And we did not see a difference there between our traditional students and the OLI students. So it's definitely possible to develop learning experiences that have that kind of durable skills acquisition. But that has a huge impact in how you design your learning experience, right? If these are the kinds of skills that you know are important, that you know that your students are going to need to carry out, then then you really need to develop the kinds of problems and assessments that target those skills and target them in ways that you can observe and provide feedback on.
There's a comment from Crystal Heshmat, who said she's interested in more details on the statistics course that was just mentioned. I know there have been several studies on it. In fact, that was what first got me interested in adaptive learning when I saw a presentation on that about a decade or so ago, where the results were pretty remarkable. So one of us can try to dig up that study or reference.
Yeah, I'm happy to share that. I can throw that into the chat.
Okay, Karen notes that we have student perception data that shows that students feel they know what to do better in the next class, but it's not a formal study. And that's part of the APLU study, or APLU has looked at that? Or is that Lumen?
That's not Lumen.
Okay, so that the APLU. Mm-hmm.
And I'd be curious to know more about that, because the studies I'm familiar with about student perception of their understanding is that students consistently overestimate their understanding. You know, when you ask them what their level of mastery is before they go into an assessment or things like that, they believe that they understand way more than they do generally. So I'd be interested in learning more about that study, Karen.
And there are some studies. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, John. David, I think that's also one of the one of the places we actually should be doing more work, right? That closing that loop and helping students to become better at estimating their own learning. You know, we've talked for years about the possibilities for these types of adaptive and digital platforms to really support better metacognitive development. And I mean, I know you and I have talked at various points about, like, wow, when we have some time, let's really dig into this. But I think that's, you know, helping to close that gap is something that could be pretty exciting.
Yeah. I have seen some studies that at least report, based on student self-report, that they perceive that their metacognition has improved. I'm not aware of any formal studies of improvements in that gap between student perception and their actual performance. But just giving students feedback regularly on what they understand is likely, at least within the course, to improve their metacognition there. How transferable that, I think, is still a pretty open question.
Yeah, I do have to say that, like, Lumen's almost 8 years old now. And in 8 years, probably one of my happiest moments ever during those 8 years was hearing a student on an adaptive learning panel talking about some of these metacognitive supports that were built into Waymaker, and talking about how she was able to use those same strategies in the course that she had taken the next semester. And, you know, it was like, you do so much work and you make so much effort, and then to hear at least one person actually say, it worked. It was just so heartening, because you don't hear students being asked those kinds of questions in a place where you can listen in on their answers very often. So,
And there are several studies that find that student persistence in the STEM fields have increased when they use adaptive learning tools, a variety of studies. And it may be partly because they can see that adapting better strategies allow them to be more successful, and that can help build a growth mindset and other things that have been shown to be effective.
yeah, and I should clarify that the studies I talked about a minute ago about students overestimating their understanding, that was overestimating their understanding of disciplinary knowledge in the course, not talking about their, kind of levels of thinking about their own learning and their metacognitive skills. I've never seen anything like that.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left, so any other questions before we move to the breakout rooms?
Prior to that, Jen, we've got the lightning talks.
Right, okay, the lightning talks, I'm sorry. Before we move to the lightning talks. Any other questions?
I have a question. The h5p.org, I mean this video, interactive video, is it free for us?
Actually, Mike Daly, can you help with an answer there? The H5P is open source. You can host it yourself and run it for free, or they have a hosted service that is a paid service. H5P.org, like Mike is saying in the chat, is a sandbox site. H5P.com is their paid hosted service. I don't know. I don't know if Suny has an agreement where they've paid for you to be able to use hosted H5P, or if you need to run it yourself if you wanted to do it for free.
I mean, okay, can you send us a link to download it or something?
Carrie Hatch did know that we don't have a license for it in Suny. So it would be something that would have to be arranged at the instructor or the campus level at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Keith Landa mentions that it is integrated into the Moodle system at purchase. Okay, well, go ahead.
Before we stop, I wonder if I can throw a question back toward Todd, which Todd gave some framing comments at the beginning here, but what do you see the role of all of this being, both in fall and as things move forward? Like where is this going from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. I think the advantage, and hopefully all three of you as panelists, I think know enough about Suny to attest to this. We actually think this area has a big future anyway, even before COVID. But I think obviously, I guess the elephant in the room here is that none of us, I think, can really pretend to know, how long the circumstances that we're going to be teaching and learning and trying to support students in are going to last. So from my point of view, that really intensifies our interest as a system in, I was heartened just in sort of following the chat and following your answers. And I'm a computer algorithm person by training. I'm actually an engineer. So the question I wanted to ask was sort of how do faculty get involved with developing tools like this? And I certainly appreciate your answers to that. I know it's not something that anybody should take on lightly, but it does occur to me that it's also an opportunity for scholarship for many of our faculty. And I think, for creative development, which I think a lot of when I talk to faculty around the system about opportunities like this, I think that's often their interest. And I was sort of glad to see that reflected in the chat today. So this is very much a going proposition from our part. Fact 2, as a point of emphasis for that group for a long time. They're advisory to me and quite influential, I think, across many of our campuses in the system. And we're sort of looking to outlets like this to learn more and to learn how, the investments we can make might have the best impact in the future. So I'm really grateful to both of you and to the other panelists later today for your contributions to our thinking about that.
Yeah, it does make me think. I said a few times that it's a lot of work, but I didn't say the corollary, which is like most things that require a ton of effort, the reward is amazing.
Yeah.
So if you look at that and you see it as a professional development opportunity or something that you'd like to be involved in, I hope you didn't take me as discouraging you from, if anyone heard that as discouraging, that's not the way I intended. I just wanted you to be eyes open about it. But wow, the rewards out the other side of it, it's just amazing. It's so fun.
And this is the time to be doing it. I mean, I think all of us are currently investing a significant amount of our effort in developing new learning resources for our students to use in the summer and the fall and whatever comes after. And if you've got that time to invest and you're trying to think, do I make another lecture video, or is there a chance here to really dive in, pick a topic I know is a challenge for my students, and really build some materials that are going to be able to help them and inform my own teaching? Much better spent on that active piece than another lecture video.
Okay, and I think now we transition to the lightning talks, and the first one is by, well, thank you for our panelists, and thank you, Provost Laursen.